Imagine being in the middle of the ocean, aboard a massive warship. Suddenly, you look to the sky and see something that freezes your blood. 85 enemy planes approaching in perfect formation. You have no aircraft to defend yourself. There's nowhere to hide. Just you, your crew, and the vastness of the ocean. This was the fate of two brave British ships on a fateful day in April 1942 in one of the most uneven battles of World War II. This is the forgotten story of how two Allied vessels faced almost impossible odds against the might of the Imperial Japanese Navy Air Service. It was April 9th, 1942. The war in the Pacific was raging furiously as the Japanese Empire expanded its dominion at a terrifying speed. Just 4 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces had conquered Hong Kong, Singapore, the Philippines, and much of Southeast Asia. Their unstoppable advance had shocked the Allied powers, who struggled to contain the Japanese offensive on multiple fronts. The rising sun flag now flew over territories once thought impregnable to enemy forces. The Japanese had demonstrated their power at Pearl Harbor and now had a new target, the British fleet in the Indian Ocean. Control of these waters would allow them to threaten India, Britain's prized colonial possession, and sever vital Allied supply lines. The pride of this British fleet was HMS Hermes, the world's first aircraft carrier specifically designed and built for that purpose, accompanied by the Australian destroyer HMAS Vampire. These two ships would soon find themselves in the crosshairs of Japan's elite naval aviators. What these brave sailors didn't know was that they had become the main target of one of the world's most lethal air fleets. The Japanese First Air Fleet, the same one that had attacked Pearl Harbor months earlier, now set its sights on these two solitary ships. Admiral Chuchi Nagumo, the mastermind behind the Pearl Harbor attack, commanded this formidable force from his flagship, the aircraft carrier Akagi. His pilots were veterans, having honed their skills in the skies over China and throughout the Pacific. What followed was one of the most devastating air attacks against warships in all of naval history. HMS Hermes had a glorious history that deserved a better fate. Launched in 1919, this pioneering 13,000-ton aircraft carrier had faithfully served the British Royal Navy for more than 2 decades. Its distinctive silhouette, with its offset island superstructure and flight deck, had become a familiar sight in ports throughout the British Empire. It could carry 20 aircraft and boasted a crew of over 600 skilled sailors. It was a symbol of British naval power, a floating airfield that projected military might across the oceans. But now it sailed in the waters of the Indian Ocean without its best defense, its own aircraft. Days earlier, they had been disembarked to strengthen the air defenses of Ceylon, present-day Sri Lanka, leaving the carrier dangerously exposed. Without its fighter planes, the ship was like a boxer with one arm tied behind his back. Its powerful anti-aircraft guns would have to suffice against what was coming, though no one aboard could have imagined the scale of the attack that was about to unfold. Sailing alongside Hermes was HMAS Vampire, a small but brave Australian destroyer of the V-class. At 1,100 tons, it was barely a fraction of the carrier's size, but it was determined to protect its larger companion. Built in 1917 as part of the British Royal Navy and later transferred to the Royal Australian Navy, the Vampire had already seen extensive action in World War II, including the evacuation of troops from Greece and Crete. The destroyer's 4.4-inch guns and depth charges made it a formidable escort against submarines, but against air attack, its defenses were limited. The Vampire's crew, made up of brave Australian sailors, knew it was their duty to escort the Hermes, regardless of the danger lurking on the horizon. Their captain, William Hardover Moran, had earned his nickname for his aggressive ship handling and decisive action in combat. These qualities would be put to the ultimate test in the hours ahead. As dawn broke over the Indian Ocean, neither he nor his crew could have imagined that this would be their final day of service aboard their beloved ship. At dawn that day, both ships received alarming news through their radio operators. A powerful force of Japanese aircraft carriers had been detected in the area. The message was brief but chilling. Enemy ships spotted approximately 100 miles east, heading in their direction. Vice Admiral Geoffrey Layton, commander of the British Eastern Fleet, ordered all ships to disperse and seek refuge. This was not a time for heroics. It was a time for survival. The Japanese force, consisting of 6 aircraft carriers for battleships and numerous cruisers and destroyers, represented the most powerful naval task force in the world at that time. Hermes and Vampire immediately set course for Trincomalee, the nearest safe harbor on the east coast of Ceylon. Their engines pushed to maximum speed, churning white foam in their wake as they raced toward safety. The port, with its anti-aircraft defenses and the possibility of air cover from RAF squadrons, offered their best chance of survival. But with a top speed of only 25 knots, the aging Hermes could not outrun the Japanese aircraft. But it was too late. Japanese scout planes, the eyes of the fleet, had already sighted the 2 ships. Flying high above the azure waters of the Indian Ocean, the Japanese reconnaissance aircraft transmitted the position of the British vessels back to their carriers. Admiral Nagumo, a methodical and experienced commander, did not hesitate to order a massive attack. This was an opportunity too good to miss. An enemy carrier caught without its aircraft, a sitting duck for his experienced pilots. Within minutes, flight crews were scrambling to their aircraft on the decks of 5 Japanese carriers. Mechanics performed last-minute checks while pilots reviewed their mission briefings. 85 aircraft took off from the carriers Akagi, Hiryu, Soryu, Shokaku, and Zuikaku. The sky filled with the roar of engines as they formed up and turned westward toward their prey. At 10:35 in the morning, under a bright tropical sun, the lookout on the Hermes Bridge spotted the first wave of Japanese planes approaching from the east. "Aircraft," he shouted into his mouthpiece. Many aircraft bearing 090. The sky, previously clear and blue, now darkened with the silhouettes of dozens of enemy warplanes. What had been a routine transit was about to become a desperate fight for survival. The alarm sounded on both ships, and the crews rushed to their battle stations. Men who had been eating breakfast or performing routine duties now ran to their posts, their faces grim with determination. Sailors stripped to the waist in the tropical heat manned the anti-aircraft guns. Engineers below decks pushed the engines to their limits. They knew that what was approaching was not just a battle. It was a matter of life and death for everyone aboard. Captain Richard Onslow of HMS Hermes, a 45-year-old veteran officer with a distinguished career, assessed the situation with remarkable calm. He ordered maximum speed and began evasive maneuvers, zigzagging to make his ship a more difficult target. "Stand to your guns, lads," he announced over the ship's loudspeakers. "Make every shot count." The anti-aircraft guns of the carrier and the destroyer pointed to the sky, ready for defense. But both officers knew they faced an overwhelming force. Without their own air cover, their chances were slim, but there was no choice but to fight to the end. The crews of both ships had drilled for this moment countless times, but facing the actual onslaught of Japan's elite naval aviators was another matter entirely. Still, they would show the enemy what British and Australian courage meant when backed into a corner. At 10:42, the first Japanese bombers began their attack. The Naval dive bombers, distinctive with their fixed landing gear and elliptical wings, peeled off from their formation and began their deadly dives. They descended at a steep angle toward the Hermes, their engines screaming as they plummeted toward the carrier. At precisely calculated moments, they released their 250 kilograms bombs, which dropped with deadly precision toward the ship's flight deck. The first explosions shook the aircraft carrier, sending shock waves through its steel hull and opening breaches in its flight deck. Columns of smoke and fire erupted where bombs struck home. Men were thrown from their feet by the force of the blasts. Some never rose again. Meanwhile, the Kate torpedo bombers approached at low altitude, skimming just above the waves, preparing their torpedoes to strike below the ship's waterline, where the armor was thinnest. The gunners of Hermes and Vampire responded with intense anti-aircraft fire. The air filled with the rapid staccato of machine guns and the deeper booms of heavier weapons. Tracers lit up the sky as the 4-inch guns and machine guns fired relentlessly at the attackers. The British and Australian sailors fought with desperate courage, knowing that their lives depended on downing as many enemy aircraft as possible. Some Japanese planes were hit, trailing black smoke from damaged engines or punctured fuel tanks as they fell into the sea in fiery crashes. Cheers erupted from the Allied gunners with each enemy aircraft brought down. But for every plane shot down, many more kept coming in relentless waves. The sky seemed filled with aircraft diving, climbing, circling, each waiting its turn to deliver a blow against the increasingly damaged ships. The first torpedoes struck the Hermes hull with tremendous force, creating enormous gaps through which the Indian Ocean began to pour in torrents. The ship shuddered from stem to stern with each impact. Below decks, damage control parties worked frantically to shore up bulkheads and stem the flooding. But with each new torpedo hit, their task became more impossible. The carrier began to list to port as water weight dragged it down on the left side. Bombs continued to fall on the deck, destroying guns and killing dozens of British sailors. Anti-aircraft positions that had been firing moments before fell silent as direct hits eliminated their crews. Fires spread across the flight deck and into the hangar below, fueled by spilled aviation fuel and oil. Black smoke billowed into the sky, visible for miles around, a testament to the ship's agony. The Hermes was dying, but not without a fight. Despite everything, the remaining crew kept fighting, desperately trying to keep their ship afloat while responding to enemy fire. Men with faces blackened by soot and oil passed ammunition to the surviving gun crews. Wounded sailors refused to leave their posts, continuing to fire at the enemy until they could no longer stand. It was a display of courage and duty that would later earn the admiration of friend and foe alike. HMAS Vampire, seeing the imminent fate of Hermes, maneuvered valiantly to try to provide additional coverage with its anti-aircraft guns. Captain Moran, true to his hard-over nickname, executed a series of tight turns that brought his vessel's guns to bear on the attacking aircraft. He ordered his ship to approach the carrier to pick up possible survivors, a dangerous move that exposed the destroyer to even greater peril. It was an act of selfless courage that exemplified the brotherhood of sailors at sea. But soon the Vampire, too, became a primary target. The Japanese bombers, after ensuring that Hermes was mortally wounded, turned their attention to the small destroyer. Dive bombers targeted the slender vessel, which offered a much more difficult target than the carrier, but was also far more vulnerable to a direct hit. Within minutes, bombs began to find their mark on the Australian ship, tearing apart its thin hull and silencing its guns one by one. At 10:55, barely 13 minutes after the start of the attack, HMS Hermes began to list dangerously to port. The angle of the deck made it increasingly difficult for sailors to maintain their footing. Water flooded its lower compartments, and fires burned out of control in several sections. The damage control parties reported that the flooding could not be contained. The ship had taken too many torpedoes below the waterline. Captain Onslow, seeing that the ship was lost and not wanting to sacrifice more lives unnecessarily, gave the order that no captain ever wants to give: abandon ship. His voice was steady over the loudspeakers, a calming presence in the chaos of battle. All hands abandon ship. God be with you all. Sailors began jumping into the water, while flames devoured what was left of the historic aircraft carrier. Many said later that Onslow stood on the tilting bridge, saluting as his men left the dying vessel. On the destroyer Vampire, the situation was equally desperate. Several direct hits had caused severe damage, and the ship was beginning to sink by the bow. Captain Moran, following the example of his colleague from the Hermes, ordered the ship to be abandoned. "Every man for himself," came the cry across the destroyer's deck. The brave Australian sailors jumped into the water as their floating home disappeared beneath the waves of the Indian Ocean. Some clung to floating debris. Others tread water in the warm but shark-infested waters. At 11:05, HMS Hermes, the first purpose-built aircraft carrier in naval history, rolled completely onto its side and then slowly slipped beneath the waters of the Indian Ocean. Air trapped in compartments escaped with loud hisses as the ship descended to its final resting place on the seabed. Barely 5 minutes later, HMAS Vampire met the same fate, its bow rising briefly into the air before the destroyer plunged to the bottom. It was all over in less than 30 minutes from the first sighting of the Japanese aircraft. 2 proud warships and hundreds of brave sailors had fallen victim to one of the most concentrated and devastating air attacks of the war. The waters around the sinking sites were littered with debris, oil slicks, and hundreds of men struggling to survive. Some were injured, others were covered in oil, and all faced an uncertain fate as they floated in the vastness of the Indian Ocean. The Japanese pilots, after confirming the destruction of both ships, formed up and returned to their carriers, celebrating another victory. For them, it was another confirmation of air power over traditional naval forces. 2 warships sunk, 0 losses to our formation, radioed the squadron leader back to the fleet. Admiral Nagumo could be satisfied. The operation had been a complete success with minimal losses. Only 4 Japanese aircraft had been shot down during the attack, a small price to pay for the destruction of an enemy carrier and destroyer. In the water, hundreds of British and Australian sailors fought to survive. Many were wounded, some seriously. Burns, shrapnel wounds, and broken bones made staying afloat a desperate struggle for many. Oil from the sunken ships covered the surface, making breathing and visibility difficult. The thick, black substance coated the sailors' skin and filled their mouths and nostrils when waves washed over them. Survivors clung to floating debris, pieces of wood, empty drums, life rafts, hoping for rescue. Some men sang to keep their spirits up. Others called out names of shipmates, trying to locate friends in the chaos. The stronger swimmers helped those who were struggling, displaying camaraderie at sea. As hours passed, exhaustion began to take its toll. Men who had survived the ferocious attack now faced the equally deadly threats of exposure, dehydration, and sharks attracted by blood in the water. Fortunately, several Indian merchant ships sailing in the area came to the rescue after seeing columns of smoke on the horizon. The SS Vita, an Indian cargo ship, was the first to arrive at the scene of the disaster. Its captain, risking his own ship in the face of possible new attacks, ordered all survivors that could be found among the waves to be picked up. The Indian crew worked tirelessly, throwing ropes and life rings. Local fishermen also played a crucial role in the rescue. Dozens of small boats set out from the coast of Ceylon to search for survivors as news of the attack spread. These simple wooden craft, powered by sail and oar, moved among the debris fields collecting exhausted sailors. The fishermen, though poor, shared what little food and water they had with the rescued men. Thanks to these combined efforts, many lives were saved that would otherwise have been lost in the immensity of the ocean. In total, 590 crew members from Hermes and 90 from Vampire were rescued. Some had spent up to 6 hours in the water before being picked up, testament to their physical endurance and will to live. The rescued men were taken to Trincomalee and later to Colombo for medical attention. But the price paid was high. 307 brave sailors from HMS Hermes lost their lives that day, including Captain Onslow, who followed the naval tradition of being the last to abandon his ship. He was last seen on the bridge, standing tall as his ship went down. From HMAS Vampire, 9 men, including Captain Moran, perished in the attack. They were victims of a ruthless war, changing naval combat. Their sacrifice would not be forgotten by their comrades who survived to continue the fight. News of the sinking shocked London and Canberra. Winston Churchill, who had already received too much bad news from the Pacific, saw another symbol of British naval power disappear. "This is a heavy blow," he wrote in his memoirs. The loss of HMS Hermes and HMAS Vampire painfully demonstrated that the era of large surface ships vulnerable to air attack had arrived. Not even the world's first aircraft carrier was safe. The age of naval warfare had changed forever. For the Japanese, it was another demonstration of their air and naval supremacy in this phase of the war. The First Air Fleet, known as Kido Butai, had added another success to its impressive record. Their confidence soared with each victory, reinforcing their belief in their own invincibility. But this victory, like many other early ones of the Japanese Empire, gave them a false sense of invincibility that would eventually lead them to underestimate their enemies. Just 1 month later, at Coral Sea, and then more decisively at Midway in June, the tide would begin to turn against them. The survivors of both ships were taken to Colombo and later repatriated to their home countries. Many of them would return to service on other ships to continue the fight against the Axis. Their testimonies about the ferocity of the Japanese attack helped the Allies better understand enemy tactics and develop more effective countermeasures for future engagements. The lessons learned from the loss of Hermes and Vampire, particularly about the vulnerability of ships without air cover and the devastating effectiveness of coordinated air attacks, would influence Allied naval strategy for the remainder of the war. Today, more than 80 years after that tragic day, the remains of HMS Hermes and HMAS Vampire rest at the bottom of the Indian Ocean, about 60 kilometers east of Trincomalee. They have become underwater sanctuaries, steel tombs for the brave who could not be rescued. Marine life has colonized the rusting hulls, transforming implements of war into vibrant artificial reefs. Occasionally, teams of divers visit these wrecks to pay tribute to those who gave their lives in such an uneven battle. They place memorial plaques and sometimes small flags to honor the fallen, ensuring they are not forgotten by future generations. This story reminds us of the brutal reality of naval warfare and how air power forever revolutionized maritime conflicts. HMS Hermes, pioneer of aircraft carriers, ironically succumbed to the weapon it itself represented: naval aviation. The ship that had helped usher in a new era of naval warfare became one of its most notable victims. Its sacrifice, along with that of HMAS Vampire, was not in vain, as the lessons learned from their loss contributed to the eventual Allied victory. The principles of naval air power demonstrated that day would go on to shape naval strategy up to the present day. The battle between 85 Japanese planes and 2 Allied ships may seem incredibly uneven, and it was. But it is also a testimony to the courage of those sailors who, knowing they faced far superior forces, fought to the end for their flag, their comrades, and their countries. Not one gun fell silent until it was destroyed or its crew incapacitated. Not one sailor surrendered in the face of overwhelming odds. Their bravery in the face of the impossible remains an example of the indomitable spirit that would eventually lead the Allies to victory. HMS Hermes and HMAS Vampire had fallen, but their story, the story of their valiant resistance against overwhelming forces, would endure far beyond their brief but glorious service. And so, what began as an uneven battle ended up becoming a legend of courage in the face of the impossible. A testament to the bravery of ordinary men facing extraordinary circumstances, a chapter in the annals of naval warfare that deserves to be remembered and honored by generations to come.